Larry Bird walking into the 2026 NBA All-Star Game would be one of the most entertaining things that basketball has ever seen. And when you really sit down and think about it honestly, without any bias, without trying to protect the modern era or dismiss the old era, you start to realize that Larry Bird in today's game would not just compete, he would absolutely take over. He would dominate. He would make people uncomfortable. He would make defenders look silly. And he would do it all while talking trash the entire time with that same calm, cold confidence that made him one of the most feared players who ever stepped on a basketball court. The reason this conversation keeps coming back up is because people who actually watched Larry Bird play cannot stop talking about him. Not in a nostalgic way where they are just being emotional about the old days. They talk about him the way you talk about someone who genuinely shocked you. Players who competed against him, players who were coached alongside him, people who covered the game during his era, they all have the same look on their face when they talk about Larry Bird. It is the look of someone who saw something they were not fully prepared for. And that reaction, that genuine feeling of being surprised by how good someone was, is something that does not happen with average players. That only happens with the truly special ones. The three-point line changes everything when you talk about Bird. One of the most important things you have to understand when talking about Larry Bird in the modern NBA is what the three-point line would have meant for his game. Because back when Bird was playing in the 1980s, the three-point shot was not the weapon it is today. Teams did not build their entire offense around shooting threes. Coaches did not design plays specifically to get their best players open three-point looks. The whole philosophy of the game was different. You attacked the paint, you posted up, you worked in the mid-range, and the three was kind of an extra thing on the side. But Bird was already one of the best shooters in the game, even without that structure around him. He was already making threes at a high level before teams even fully understood how to use that part of the game. So now imagine you take Larry Bird and you put him in today's NBA, where the entire offense is designed to create open three-point shots, where spacing the floor is the #1 priority, where you are not allowed to put your hands on offensive players the way defenders used to do, and where the refs call fouls much more quickly than they ever did in the 1980s. Now you have Larry Bird in the perfect environment. Now you have a player whose shooting ability, whose basketball IQ, and whose toughness are all built perfectly for the game as it is played today. People who really know basketball have said it clearly. Bird would be shooting 8 to 10 three-pointers per game in today's NBA. And given his accuracy and his history in shooting contests, you have to believe a large percentage of those would be going in. When you combine that with his ability to pass, his rebounding, his post game, and his mid-range shot, you were talking about a player who could put up 50 points a night if the game called for it. Not because he would be trying to score 50, but because the game would just naturally get there with someone as skilled and as complete as Bird was. He won every three-point shooting contest he ever entered. Not some of them, not most of them, every single one. Now think about what that means in the context of the 2020.
You have all of these modern shooters, all of these players who have been trained from the time they were teenagers to shoot from deep, all of these guys with perfect mechanics and perfect training programs, and then you have Larry Bird walking in with that same calm look on his face, asking who is finishing second. That image alone should tell you everything about what kind of player he was. The confidence was not empty. It was not arrogance without substance. It was backed up by real skill, real preparation, and a real understanding of his own ability that very few players in any era have ever had. And in an all-star setting specifically, where the defense is relaxed and the game is more open, Bird would be completely unstoppable. The whole format of the All-Star game plays directly into everything that made Bird great. Wide open space, more movement, less physical defense, more opportunity to show off individual skill. Bird in that environment would be something nobody in the modern era has ever seen before, and the reactions from the other players on the floor would be something to watch all on its own. The clutch factor is something people forget to talk about. One of the things that sometimes gets lost in the conversation about Larry Bird is just how good he was when the game was on the line, because with all the talk about his shooting and his passing and his trash talking, the clutch element of his game sometimes does not get the attention it deserves. But people who watched him closely, people who competed against him in big moments, have been very clear about this. They say they cannot remember Bird missing a big shot in a big game. Think about that. In a career full of big moments, in a career that included championship runs and legendary playoff series and some of the most pressure-filled games in NBA history, they cannot recall him missing when it mattered most. That is not a small thing. That is actually one of the rarest qualities a basketball player can have. Being able to perform at your highest level when the pressure is at its highest, when the crowd is loud, when the game is on the line, when everything is riding on one shot, that is where true greatness separates itself from just being a good player. And Bird had that quality in a way that very few players in the history of the game have had it. He was not just good in big moments, he seemed to get better. He seemed to want those moments. He seemed to thrive in exactly the kind of pressure that breaks most players. When people were asked who they would want with the ball in the last few seconds of a game, with everything on the line, players and analysts from that era consistently put Bird at or near the very top of that list. One person said Bird was the first name that came to mind. Not a hesitation, not a debate, just Bird right away. Because that is what he meant to people who understood the game at a deep level. He was the guy you wanted when everything mattered. Now, let us address something that comes up sometimes in the Larry Bird conversation, and that is the comments Dennis Rodman made after the 1987 Eastern Conference Finals. For context, Detroit played Boston in that series, and Boston beat them in 7 games. After that 7th game, Rodman came out and said that Bird was overrated.
He went further and said that Bird was only getting all of this praise and all of these accolades because he was white, and that if he were black, he would just be another player. Here is the problem with that statement. In the very game that Rodman made those comments about, Larry Bird had just dropped 37 points, 9 assists, and 9 rebounds on Rodman, in a game that eliminated Rodman's team from the playoffs. So the person who Rodman was calling overrated had just dismantled his team and ended his season with one of the most complete individual performances you could ask for. The numbers speak clearly. The game result speaks clearly. Bird did not just beat Rodman that night. He absolutely took over and made it look like Rodman's team had no answer for him at all. Rodman is a Hall of Fame defender. Nobody is taking that away from him. He was one of the best rebounders ever and one of the most intense defenders the game has seen. But the idea that Bird's greatness was somehow a product of his skin color rather than his skill is something that falls apart the moment you look at what Bird actually did on the court, and especially the moment you look at what Bird did to Rodman's team in that very series. The players who competed against Bird and respected him the most were not doing so out of any kind of bias. They were doing so because he made them feel it on the court in a way that could not be ignored. Bird versus the modern stars, the matchup nobody wants to see. Because when people start asking what Larry Bird would do against the best players in today's game, things get very interesting very quickly. People brought up Kevin Durant as one of the most obvious comparisons and one of the most difficult matchups you could think of. KD is 7 feet tall, he can shoot from anywhere, and he is almost impossible to defend because of his size and skill combination. He is one of the most unique offensive players the game has ever produced. But here's what people said when Bird versus KD came up. They said Bird is unguardable. They said it with the same certainty that they said KD is unguardable. And that is the interesting thing. When you put two truly unguardable players against each other, what you get is not one of them shutting the other down. What you get is a battle of who can make the most plays, who can impose their will more consistently, and who wants it more in the critical moments. And if you have watched any film on Larry Bird, if you have listened to anyone who ever competed against him, you already know the answer to that last part. Bird wanted it more than almost anyone. That competitive fire was not something he could turn off. It was just who he was.
The idea of Bird matched up against Karl Anthony Towns also came up, and that was described as a nightmare situation for Towns. And it makes sense when you think about it. Bird at 6'9" with a complete offensive game, the ability to score from everywhere, the vision to find open teammates, and the toughness to compete physically even against bigger players. That is a genuinely difficult thing to defend regardless of what era you are playing in. The skills translate. The IQ translates. The competitiveness definitely translates. Bird made enemies watch him and become fans. There is a story that gets told about Larry Bird that captures something very real about what kind of player he was. Someone who grew up in New York, who naturally had reason to dislike the Celtics, talked about how the moment he saw Bird in that green uniform, something in him just reacted negatively. It was not something he was taught. It was not something his family pushed on him. It was just a natural feeling. He saw Bird and he did not like him. That is how strong the rivalry was, how real the emotions were around that Celtics team. But even that person, even someone who started out genuinely disliking Larry Bird, ended up being shaped by watching him play. He said Bird changed his life. He said watching Bird and Magic together, but really watching Bird specifically, gave him something. It inspired him. It pushed him to develop parts of his own game. Even the people who came to the arena wanting to see Bird lose ended up walking out having been affected by what Bird showed them. That is the mark of a truly special player, when even your opponents, even the fans who are rooting against you, cannot help but be moved by what they see. Magic Johnson himself, one of the greatest players ever and Bird's greatest rival,
The relationship those two had went beyond basketball. They started as rivals, they grew into something that looked like mutual admiration, and eventually Magic has been openly emotional about his feelings toward Bird. The respect between those two is one of the most genuine things in sports history. And when Magic Johnson tells you that someone is special, you listen. Because Magic competed against Bird at the highest level in the biggest games year after year, and he saw firsthand what Bird could do. Is Bird still a top 10 player of all time? This is the part of the conversation that can get a little tricky, and it is worth addressing honestly. Some people in the media have started to suggest that Bird might be dropping out of the all-time top 10 as more modern players build their legacies. The argument goes that as the game evolves and as new players come along, some of the older legends naturally get pushed down the list. And look, it is fair to have that conversation. Legacies do shift over time. New players do come along and push boundaries that previous generations set. That is how sports work, and that is how history works. But what is also true is that Larry Bird had a window of dominance that is almost impossible to match. Those first 7 or 8 years of his NBA career, before his back problems became severe, before his body started breaking down, that stretch of basketball was as dominant and as impressive as anything any player has ever done at any position in any era. You can put those years up against anyone and make a legitimate case. The argument for keeping Bird in the top 10 is not about nostalgia. It is about looking honestly at what he did and how he did it. He walked into a Boston Celtics organization that had won 29 games the year before he arrived, and in his first season they won 61. Then they won a championship. That kind of immediate impact is not something that happens with average players. That is the impact of someone who changes the entire culture and competitiveness of a franchise from the moment they walk in the door. Whether you believe Bird belongs in the top 5, the top 10, or somewhere just outside it, the honest answer is that his greatness is not in question. The only debate is about exactly where to rank him among a very short list of the most exceptional players who have ever played the game. Bird in the 2026 NBA All-Star Game. What does that actually look like? It looks like a player walking in with total confidence, fully aware of exactly what he can do and exactly how he plans to do it. It looks like someone who doesn't care about the names on the other team's roster, doesn't care about the size or athleticism of the players defending him, and doesn't care about any expectations anyone else has set. It looks like Bird doing what Bird always did,
finding the spots on the floor where he is most dangerous, getting the ball in those spots, and making defenders pay every single time. It looks like 8 to 10 three-point attempts, and a high percentage of them going in. It looks like perfect passes that set up teammates for easy baskets. It looks like pulling up from the mid-range and draining it like it's a practice drill. It looks like a player who, even in a game that is supposed to be relaxed and fun, is quietly putting together a performance that leaves everyone watching saying they cannot believe what they just saw. And it definitely looks like trash talk. Calm, quiet, devastating trash talk, delivered with that flat Indiana accent to whoever happens to be guarding him at the moment. That was always part of Bird's game, not the kind of loud, emotional trash talk that's designed to get attention, the kind that is whispered right before he does exactly what he said he was going to do, the kind that gets into your head and stays there long after the game is over. The kind that KD and the modern players have never had to deal with, because there hasn't been another Larry Bird since the original one. The players in today's NBA are exceptional. The athleticism, the skill level, the conditioning, the training, it's all at a level that previous generations didn't have access to. But basketball is not just a game of athleticism. It never has been. It's a game of skill, intelligence, instinct, and will. And on all four of those things, Larry Bird belongs in any conversation about the best to ever do it. Put him in the 2026 NBA All-Star Game, and you would see exactly why the people who watched him play cannot stop talking about him all these years later. The man was just different, and some things, no